I'm Linus. Welcome to Kids Talk Church History, a one-of-a-kind podcast where kids investigate the history of the church. Over 2,000 years ago, Jesus said, "I will build my church, and the gates of hell will not prevail against it." Has he kept his promise? How has Jesus built and preserved his church against all odds? Come with us on a trip through history to find the answer, here on Kids Talk Church History.
After the Reformation, many small groups emerged that interpreted it differently than the original reformers. These groups had some pretty weird names, such as Quakers, Ranters, Seekers, Diggers, and Mugglitans, and so on. But what did they believe? How were they different from the other Protestants at the time? Find out the answers to all these questions and more on this episode of Kids Talk Church History. Hi, my name is Trinity, and I am 16. I live in Charleston, South Carolina.
And I'm Christian, and I am 14, and I live in Charleston, South Carolina.
I'm Emma. I'm also 16, and I live in Raleigh, North Carolina.
And we actually have a new host to introduce you all to. Would you like to tell us a little bit about yourself, Ruth?
Hi, my name is Ruth, and I'm 9 years old, and I live in Atlanta, Georgia.
Welcome to the podcast, Ruth. I hope that you're going to have a great time hosting with us all.
Thank you.
How did all of these groups start?
I'm not sure about all of them, but I've read something about the Anabaptists who believe that the church would separate themselves from the rest of the world and churches should not work together with city councils.
I heard of Baptists, but what does Anabaptists mean?
Well, the prefix Anna comes from the Greek and means again because Anabaptists baptized people who had already been baptized as infants. They thought that the baptism was only for those who expressed their faith, while Roman Catholics, Lutherans, Reformed, and Eastern Orthodox Christians thought it was a sign of God's promise and should not be grounded in someone's faith.
Do Baptists today believe the same?
Well, our expert today is actually a Baptist pastor, so we can ask him later on.
Their idea that they should have nothing to do with city councils must have made the government pretty nervous, since rulers at the time thought that having a state religion was the only way to keep the peace.
Yeah, and some of their worries actually became true when some radical Anabaptists started a revolution in the German city of Münster. The occupation failed, and many Anabaptists ended up in prison. Their leaders were executed, but most Anabaptists were peaceful. I think there were other reasons why the other Protestants rejected them. Luther was especially concerned when one of the radical leaders claimed to be following God's Spirit to the point that he neglected the scriptures. Luther said he swallowed the Holy Spirit, feathers and all.
Of course, the Holy Spirit has no feathers.
Yeah, Luther has some very funny expressions that he uses. This is probably a reference to the time of Jesus' baptism when the Spirit descended like a dove. He just basically meant that these Anabaptists acted as if they were so full of the Spirit that they didn't need God's written word.
And the Belgic confession we use in some Reformed churches went even further, calling the Anabaptists heretics because of what they believed about Jesus as a man. But that might be too much for this episode. I think the main lesson is that it's dangerous to think that we know better than the rest of the church. Even Luther was really reluctant to separate from the Church of Rome.
Yeah, and like most other Protestants, Luther only did so when he was convinced that they were really following both the scriptures and the teachings of the early church. They saw it as a continuation and not as a break.
Who are some of the other groups?
Well, we can't just list them all, so we're going to leave some of them to our expert. But I think one of the main groups was called the Quakers.
Oh, I've heard of that one. Are they related to Quaker Oats?
I don't think so. I looked it up, and it seems that the company which first produced Quaker Oats chose the picture of a Quaker as a symbol of quality and purity.
Okay, so at least they had a pretty good reputation.
Yeah. In the 19th century, they did, but the reformers warned against them because they emphasized on an inner light and rejected any formal creeds or church structures. Their worship meetings were times of silence, interrupted when people thought that the Spirit was speaking to them.
They were also pacifists. One good thing about them is that in America, they were one of the first groups to oppose slavery.
Well, our knowledge of these groups is actually very limited to what little we have actually read, but we have a wonderful expert, Dr. Michael Haykin, who can explain these groups to us. Dr. Haykin has been on our podcast before, and he's the professor of church history and biblical spirituality and director at the Andrew Fuller Center for Baptist Studies. Dr. Haykin, thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate it.
Yeah, it's great to be with you.
So you've heard us talk a little bit about the Anabaptists and the Quakers. Is there anything that we got wrong or anything that you would like to add to just fully give us a picture of what we're talking about?
Yeah, what you outlined there was really great. The Anabaptists and the Quakers live in different periods, though. The Anabaptists are 16th century, and the Reformers were very concerned with them, as you indicated. The Quakers come in the 17th century, so the Quakers come 100 years later, and they're basically at that time only located in England. The Anabaptists would have been on the European continent. They begin in Switzerland, and then you find them in Holland, Germany, and other parts, Poland. And there were a few in England, but the Quakers were pretty well restricted to England until many, many years later after their first appearance.
Speaking about the Quakers, I heard that they named themselves that, or they were called that because their personal experience of Jesus made them quake or tremble. Did they choose this name, or did others call them that?
Yeah, like a lot of groups in church history, the name Quaker was used against them. They didn't choose it. They called themselves the Society of Friends, or the Friends. And Quaker was a term that was used because in some of their meetings, when they experienced the Holy Spirit's presence, they would begin to tremble or quake. And so this was a derogatory term, a term that was really kind of a put down used by their opponents.
So, a lot of the groups had weird names like Ranters and Diggers. Can you give us a brief description of these two groups and their names?
Yeah, so the Ranters and Diggers emerge in the 1640s, the same time as the Quakers. So it's a period of real turmoil in England. It's the period of what we call the English Civil Wars, where another group, the Puritans, who had been within the Church of England for probably about 80 years at that point, found themselves in opposition to the king. And you had a state of civil war for about 10 years. And the Puritan leadership relaxed the censorship of the press, and all kinds of groups started to emerge. The Ranters, there's a lot of debate about whether the Ranters actually existed as a group, but there were individuals who believed that the more sin you did, the more grace you got. So they were really flagrant in their disobedience of God's commands. Generally speaking, they were men and women who swore a lot, did a lot of evil things. And they became known as the Ranters because they would rant in terms of their speech. The Diggers were really kind of an early communist group. During the Civil War, they were opposed to the fact that probably 60 to 70% of England was owned by about 2% of the population, the aristocracy, the king, the queen, all the dukes, the nobles. And the Diggers, and they had another group called the Levelers, they believed that all of that property needed to be turned over to the people. And they would go out onto the lands of dukes and noblemen, and they just simply start to dig up the land and plant vegetable gardens and all kinds of things like that, claiming that the land was theirs. And they basically disappear with the Ranters probably around 1660. But they were in the middle of the Civil War. These individuals kind of emerged, and they were very unruly and almost anarchistic.
Yeah, so I know the Quakers are still around today, but what about the others? And I know that you talked about how some of them disappeared. When was that time when they disappeared?
Yeah, so the Diggers and the Levelers basically disappeared about 1660, as did the Ranters. The Quakers persisted. Their early origins were very, very unruly again. But by the 1670s, they've kind of quietened down, and they've become committed to pacifism, as you mentioned. And then, very importantly, in the United States, they are the first group to oppose slavery and the slave trade. and they become by the 1750s. You could not be a Quaker if you were involved in slavery or the slave trade, and they are a very, very powerful voice against that whole institution. In the 19th century, in the 20th centuries, they've been a very powerful voice for doing good works, for various helping with various social problems in society, and then especially pacifism. They're very committed to the fact that war is an evil, and Quakers have been a very strong voice for Christians should not be involved in wars, manufacturing guns, weapons, and so on.
Did the Mennonites and Amish come from the Anabaptists? I think I've heard that before.
Yeah, so that again, they're on the continent, and so the Mennonites, the Anabaptists also go through a period of change. After the incident in Munster that you mentioned, the kind of revolts, most Anabaptists became pacifists also, and the Mennonites emerged very early on in probably the 1530s. Their leader was a man named Menno Simons. Originally in Holland, and eventually a lot of the Mennonites in the 1700s will end up in Russia. And the Russian government gave them land to develop. But then in the course of the 18th century and early 19th century, there were a lot of attacks by Russians on the Mennonites. And a lot of Mennonites emigrated to South America, Mexico, and also to America. And so Pennsylvania, you have a lot of Mennonites in Pennsylvania. The Amish emerge in the early 1700s. They're a very, very strict order of Mennonites. They don't believe in any modern technology. They don't use cars. They don't use things like refrigerators, even down to zippers on pants. They don't believe the zippers are good. And so they'll when their pants they'll use buttons and not zippers. And so the Amish are mostly found in Pennsylvania, and very, very, very conservative in their dress, in their way of life. Basically, they take around 1750 or 1800 as kind of the cutoff point, and anything that's been developed since then, computers, technology is just not good.
Okay, following up on that, how did they decide that 1800 was the year after which everything was bad, but before then it was good? How did that decision come about?
To be honest, I don't know, but it sounds from my point of view, speaking as an outsider, it just sounds weird. Like, why 1800? Like, why are buttons okay and zippers aren't?
Yeah, it feels a little arbitrary.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly.
So I read that the Muggletonians rejected one of the most fundamental doctrines, that of the Trinity. Did any of the other groups reject similar core doctrines, or is there anything that you can say about the Muggletonians?
Yeah, so let me deal with the Muggletonians first. The Muggletonians are a group I find really interesting. They were founded by a man named Ludovic Muggleton in the 1650s. Again, England, Civil War. And he and his cousin, John Reeve, believed that God had sent them as the final two prophets for Christianity. They didn't believe in prayer. They did have preaching, and they didn't believe in the Trinity. And they had a very weird kind of view of the end times, how things were going to unfold. The last Muggletonian, their group survived well into the 20th century. The last Muggletonian died around 1960. And he had a library, a fabulous library of 17th century books that were given to the University of Cambridge, about 400 of them. And so that really kind of gave students of history a fabulous treasure trove of how to understand this very, very small little group, really kind of a weird group. The Anabaptists and the other groups, the Quakers, generally speaking, were orthodox in their theology. They believed in the Trinity, believed in prayer. The Anabaptists generally so, although there were certain Anabaptists who believed that Jesus, the humanity, existed in heaven before he was born, which sounds really odd. And so they believe that Jesus' humanity, he brought it from heaven, and Mary didn't contribute anything to his humanity. Even though, so Mary is the receptacle, you might use that term, in which this divine humanity was placed. And but there were that view of by the Anabaptists was basically nobody believed that, probably by the 1800s or late 1700s.
So, what's the difference then between these groups and other groups like the Puritans or the Separatists who also didn't agree with the official church?
Yeah, so the Puritans, they had quarrels with the state church in England, the Church of England, but generally speaking, most of the Puritans, 90% of them, wanted a state church. They just disagreed with the way the state church was set up. The Anabaptists, the Quakers, disagreed with the idea of a state church completely. And they believed that churches should be composed simply of believers. And the Puritans, by and large, so when you see that when they come to America, they really set up kind of state churches in New England. And if you were a Baptist or a Quaker in New England, you could find yourself in real trouble. And there are examples of Baptists and Quakers being imprisoned. And in fact, there was a Quaker woman actually hung in Boston in the 1600s. So the difference between the Puritans and these groups, the Quakers, the Muggletonians, and so on, is these groups, the latter groups, did not believe in a state church. Baptists, I'm a Baptist, Baptists come out of the same period, and Baptists would share the idea of the Quakers that the idea of a state church is wrong, because all too frequently a state church ends up persecuting people. If you don't believe what we believe, then we'll put you in prison.
So, overall, what can we learn from the experiences of these groups, or what can we take away from this?
I think one thing I would take away is the importance of diversity. That even though I would disagree with the Quakers on a number of things, I would be very hesitant to say that God wasn't working through them, especially in the 18th century. The Quakers are remarkable in their realization that slavery is fundamentally wrong, and the stand that they take against slavery is so important. And a lot of other Christians, like John Wesley, who's a Methodist, and some of my Baptist forebears, learned from the Quakers that slavery was something they had to fight, and they had to get it abolished. I do think that what these groups indicate is that in times of turmoil, you find God at work raising up very interesting groups. I wouldn't say all of them, like the Ranters definitely were not a Christian group. And the Diggers and the Levelers to me sound like communists who basically want to, destroy all private property. But some of the groups, as I said, Quakers, and the group that I come from, Baptists, Baptists emerge in this period. I think both of them also speak against the idea of a state church. I think the idea of a state church where the church and the state are like that, they're joined, as it were, they're two sides of a coin. I personally find that fundamentally problematic.
Do you have a favorite story about one of these groups?
Oh, do I have a favorite story? Yeah, one of them is about a man named Benjamin Lay, who was a Quaker. And he was very small. He was around 4'8", 4'9". And he was very concerned in the 1730s about the fact that some Quakers were involved in slavery. And so he went to a meeting one day of Quakers, and he had a Bible, what a booklet looked like a Bible. And what he had done was he had cut out a hole in the Bible and put a pig's bladder, pig stomach in the Bible and filled it with blood. And so at a certain point in the meeting, he stood up, because Quakers would allow anybody to stand up and speak. And he began to basically say, if you're here today and you're involved in slavery and you have slaves, it's wrong and God's going to judge you. And at that point, he pulled out a sword. He had a sword hidden, and he plunged it into the book, into the pig's bladder or stomach, and the blood went spurting all over the place, covering a number of people who were sitting close beside him. And they were horrified. But he went on to say, the blood of these slaves is on your head. And so he used a very, very graphic illustration to drive home the fact that slavery is repugnant to God, and so on. He was a very, very significant literally little figure. He's not well known, but I think the courage that he showed and his determination are ones that I think we need to show. And he refused to go along with the majority of people. Majority of people thought slavery was fine. And he realized, no, it's wrong. It is wrong that what we're doing. And it's a great little story.
Thank you. I know you have been on our podcast before, so we're not going to ask the same final questions. But if you could meet one person from the 17th century, who would that be?
Oh, that's a great question. I actually am reading and writing about a woman named Brilliana Harley. Brilliana. Very unusual name. She was born in a Dutch town called Brill, and her father thought it'd be great to name her after the town, Brilliana, which is not a usual woman's name. Anyway, I've been reading her letters to her son in the 1630s. Her son was 14, and he went up to Oxford University to study. And they're just gorgeous letters. Advising him spiritually about things like he needs to be careful about who he chooses as his friends. And then other things like about the sort of clothes he's wearing. She's always sending him food. And I'm not sure if the food got there or if it got there, it was still edible. But I'd love to meet her. I'd love to sit down. She was a very courageous woman. In the middle of the Civil War, she had a castle, and the castle was besieged. And she was able to hold the castle against the besiegers for about 2 months. All the roofs of the castle were blown out, and she was really quite a remarkable woman. And I'd love to meet her.
Well, Dr. Haykin, thank you so much for spending this time with us and answering our questions. And listeners, keep telling us what you think of these episodes and keep asking these hard questions. We'll pass them on to our guest experts as soon as possible. And we're planning a big giveaway for Christmas with a bunch of books by Simonetta Carr, courtesy of Reformation Heritage Books. So keep writing in. In partnership with the Alliance of Confessing Evangelicals, and on behalf of my co-hosts, Christian, Ruth, and Emma, I am Trinity, and thank you so much for listening to Kids Talk Church History.